In a normal active sentence, the structure of English goes subject, verb, object, something like Karen ate another biscuit. Inversion is when this order of words gets moved around. Inversion can happen in two basic ways, what are called subject-verb inversion and subject-auxiliary inversion. So in subject-verb inversion, the verb is placed before the subject, and in subject-auxiliary inversion, the auxiliary verb is placed before the subject. Everyone who knows even just a little bit of English uses inversion in yes-no questions. This won't be covered in this video because for yes-no questions, this is the normal word order. So if someone states something that is the same as another person or thing, we can use this structure to reply in agreement. If the statement is a positive one, start with so, but if it's negative, use neither or nor. They mean the same, but nor is considered more literary. Then it's the do verb, an auxiliary verb, or be verb, then followed by a subject. For example, if a statement uses a verb with no auxiliary verbs, use do, like, I love biscuits, so do I. If the statement uses an auxiliary verb, use the same auxiliary verb, like, I don't think I'll go out tonight. Okay, neither will I. Remember, if the statement is a negative statement, then the auxiliary verb is still positive. If the statement uses a be verb, use a be verb in the reply too. It's like this that it's also employed by children and adults as a cheap but effective counter-argument during quarrels. Using this kind of inversion does speed things up. For example, if somebody says, I like the Beatles, and the other person likes the Beatles too, they could say, yes, I like the Beatles too, or using a pronoun, yes, I like them too. It's not wrong, but really the fastest way to show concurrence with the other person is just to say, so do I. As a teacher, I don't hear this structure nearly often enough, even though it is said by natives all the time. So while this structure might seem obvious to native speakers, it might not actually be that obvious to English students. Inversion after adverbs of location and direction can happen in a couple of different ways. The first way this sort of inversion occurs is when we wish to say if something is moving towards or away from us in the present moment. We start with an adverb of location, like here or there, then followed by the verbs come or go, then followed by a subject. It's the kind of construction that you may be familiar with from songs, such as the Beatles' Here Comes the Sun, or the Foo Fighters' There Goes My Hero, or the Pixies' Here Comes Your Man. But while it's a very basic construction, and there's nothing much to it, it's actually a little more interesting than most people realise. That's because this kind of construction needs to be inverted for it to express its particular meaning. So for example, imagine a situation where two friends are waiting at a bus stop. When the bus is first seen in the distance, one may say to the other, here comes the bus. Now, if they just said the bus comes here, it would simply indicate it's a habit of the bus, that it regularly arrives at this place, not that it's arriving at that moment. It's actually closer in meaning to a present continuous sentence like the bus is coming. An important point about inversion after adverbs of location is that it cannot be used with pronouns. The example of here comes the bus using a pronoun would be here it comes, and this doesn't have subject-verb inversion. The second way I'm going to talk about inversion is when it's used to add a dramatic flourish to a point in the story. This kind of inversion happens frequently after adverbs of direction, like up, in, out, away, along, etc., then followed by a verb, then the subject. Native speakers often encounter it at a young age as it's found in the nursery rhyme Little Miss Muffet. Unlike the previous way that this sort of inversion gets used, this kind doesn't change meaning if it's not inverted. As I said, it gets used when people are telling stories to their friends and may get used at the end of a funny anecdote. For example, and just as I was leaving the store, in came this man dressed in a dinosaur outfit. If you can use this in a speaking exam, the examiner will probably get rather excited. It's not only used in speech or in nursery rhymes, but more complex forms are used in literature too, often with the adverb taking the form of an adverbial phrase, like, in the corner stood an old man. Or in the hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Okay, I know. I've cheated a little bit. I just like this line. A lot of people would say that this isn't actually inversion because although it uses an adverbial phrase, the there, what we call a dummy there, is actually acting as a subject. So if we regard the there as the subject, it's actually going before the verb. But it's a kind of inversion. And in these sorts of sentences, the dummy there is actually kind of optional. So I'm going to include it because I like it. So inversion like this is closely related to something called fronting, which is when we move other elements of the sentence to the front or to the beginning of the sentence. Although fronting doesn't necessarily involve inverting the verb and the subject. Either way, using this helps to add tension to the story by moving the subject to the end of the sentence. The reader isn't told immediately who or what is doing such a thing. So a non-inverted fronted sentence using an adverbial could be something like, in the corner an old man stood, compared to the inverted form, in the corner stood an old man. One thing about fronting using adverbials like this is that if it's the to be verb, it has to be inverted. The grammar gods don't allow you to front a subject with the be verb without using inversion. At the bus stop was an old lady, not at the bus stop an old lady was. In a normal sentence, someone might say, I never broke any lockdown rules, or I didn't break any lockdown rules in any way. To make the sentence sound more emphatic, we can shift the negative adverb to the front or the beginning of the sentence. A negative adverbial is a word or phrase which modifies a verb, adjective, another adverb, or even a whole sentence in some kind of negative or limiting way. If it's a one or two word adverbial, they normally go before the verb. If it's an adverbial phrase which starts with a preposition, or if it's a phrase that begins with any, like any more or any longer, then it goes at the end of the sentence. So the sentences I just said could be, never did I break any lockdown rules, or in no way did I break any lockdown rules. So the basic form of this kind of inversion goes, negative adverbial, then the auxiliary verb, then the subject, then the main verb, and then the rest of the sentence. However, there are some important things to remember when we're using it. If the normal sentence doesn't have any auxiliary verbs, some form of do will need to be used as an auxiliary verb in the inverted form. And the main verb becomes a bare verb as the tense is now indicated by the do verb. Secondly, in the non-inverted sentence, if it is a negative sentence with an adverbial phrase going at the end and uses the word any, then for the inverted sentence, when the adverbial was placed at the beginning of the sentence, any is replaced with no and the negative auxiliary verb becomes positive. The last point I want to make about forming these kinds of sentences is with the adverbial only, where we have another word such as only then or only if or only after, etc. Then the sentences can get pretty long before we see the inversion. And importantly, if in a normal sentence only is followed by the subject of the sentence, then we cannot invert it. So if I said the phrase, only you can save me, we cannot invert it to, only can you save me. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. So a lot of the examples I've shown so far have been of a certain politician stressing a denial of improper behaviour. And this shows one way it gets used, to emphatically deny something. But it gets used in other ways too. Like I said at the start of the video, signs which prohibit some kind of behaviour often begin with a phrase like, under no circumstances. It also gets used in the not only but also sentence structure. So if I said something like, the man is not only incompetent but also a terrible liar, then we can invert this sentence to be, not only is the man incompetent but also a terrible liar. It can also be used when criticising someone or something as a way of emphasising the rarity of its awfulness. So for example, if you heard the Spotify top 10, you may be tempted to say, I have rarely heard such garbage pretending to be music. And this could be inverted too. Rarely have I heard such garbage pretending to be music. Like this, we can use it to reprimand someone's terrible behaviour, although doing so can lead to accusations of pomposity, if done with a tone of entitlement. So for example, never have I been spoken to so rudely in all my life. Or, no longer will I tolerate such laziness from you. On the flip side, it gets used when praising someone or something, and in these cases it's used to emphasise how good some aspect of it is. So if we had a non-inverted sentence like, I seldom drink such fine wine, Prime Minister, then we can invert it to, seldom do I drink such fine wine, Prime Minister. So, what do I mean by inversion after so and such? Well, let me first explain it with so. When we have a sentence that uses a phrase of so plus an adjective and before a clause that explains some kind of effect, we can move this phrase to the start of the sentence. And when we do this, we must invert the subject and the be verb, hence why it's called inversion after so and such. It's the same when we use an adverb. If the normal sentence doesn't have an auxiliary verb, then we use some form of do as an auxiliary verb in the inverted sentence and then put the main verb after the subject. In these sorts of sentences, so is used as an intensifier, similar in meaning to very. So actually has loads of different meanings, as you can see here. It's quite an interesting topic, kind of. But well, how about with such? When we have a sentence that uses the word such, meaning so much or so great, then we can move such to the beginning of the sentence and invert the subject and the be verb. We can find this construction in the idiom of such is the case. Far less common today, but still possible to find in literature from the past and still grammatically correct, is to use this inversion after a noun phrase that uses the word such. However, unless you are writing in an archaic register, like a parody of Jane Austen or something, then I strongly advise you not to use this construction, as it does look very old. So, when do we use it? Well, inversion after so and such happens almost exclusively in writing, or writing that is going to be spoken, like a news report. The only possible exception to this is the idiom such is the case. It's not that it's wrong to use it in a conversation. If you can do it, then that's cool. But it can seem overly formal. Although personally I think it's pretty neat when I hear it in a conversation, although that's rare. But I'm one of those people that thinks sounding formal can sound classy at times. As long as you're with the right crowd, then you should be okay. Think of an academic setting rather than at the supermarket. So why do we use it then? We use inversion after so and such to add emphasis, to add force, to the adjective or adverb that comes after it. However, we may decide to use inversion after so and such to help the flow of the writing. One way it can do this is by varying the sentence structures. Writing is always more engaging if the writer doesn't repeat themselves. And while this is especially true with words, it's also very true with sentence structures. And another way it can help is to make our writing sound more poetic. Take for example this sentence. The heavy footsteps grew louder until they stopped abruptly outside my door. My heart beating faster and faster. It was beating so fast that I thought I would pass out. We could invert the last sentence to continue the alliterative effect of the words faster and faster, such as, the heavy footsteps grew louder until they stopped abruptly outside my door. My heart beating faster and faster. So fast was it beating that I thought I would pass out. As you can see, it gives the writing a different flow. You may prefer it or you may not, but it does give you another option. So you might be asking yourself, well, I already know how to make conditional sentences. Why would I need to know how to make inverted conditionals? And the simple answer is, you may feel it's better to maintain a kind of distance between you and the reader or listener. To an audience that you don't know, or for an academic paper, they are more formal. And as with most forms of inversion, if you manage to throw them into your English exams, the examiners will love you. So, how do we invert conditional sentences? So firstly, it's important to bear in mind that when we talk about inverting conditionals, we are only talking about inverting the if clause. The main clause stays the same. Secondly, they all follow a basic subject auxiliary form of inversion. In negative sentences, we place a not before the main verb. Now let's look at each conditional and how to invert them. So I'm going to do the zero and first conditionals together because in their grammar forms, the difference is only found in the main clause. The zero and first conditionals are often the first conditionals that we teach to students, but funnily enough, they are actually the trickiest to invert. This is because in their normal form, we don't use an auxiliary verb, but we need to use an auxiliary verb when we invert it. To understand the inverted form, we need to know a more formal version of the regular sentence. This is created by adding the word should before the main verb. If you should need me, I will be able to answer any questions you have. What this should does is indicate the unlikely nature of this event. So to use the example I've just given, it's like saying, I have given you lots of information and I don't think you will have any questions, but if you do have any questions, I will be able to answer them. So to create the inversion of these conditionals, we start with the word should, then we have the subject, then we have a present simple verb. Should you have any questions, I will be able to answer them. Should water reach 100 degrees, it boils. This inversion is very formal, and some people say you find it mostly in writing. But in my experience, I have also found it said by people providing services in high-end establishments like posh hotels or fancy restaurants. Although in these situations, it's also highly likely that the people have been trained to use this expression, rather than the phrase being said spontaneously as part of the person's normal idiolect. Also, I found it in a computer game.
Should you need something, I will be happy to oblige.
So let's look at inverting the second conditional. There are two ways we can invert the second conditional. The first way is when the if clause uses a be verb, the subjunctive were, like if I were a rich man, I'd buy an island. To invert this sentence, we remove if and place the be verb, were, at the start of the sentence. We then follow it with the subject and then the object. Were I a rich man, I would buy an island. We use another way of inverting the second conditional if the if clause doesn't use a be verb. Here, we still use were to start the if clause and still followed by its subject, but only this time we follow this up with a to infinitive verb and then the object if it has one. Were I to become a politician, I would probably accept donations from questionable oligarchs. So there's a few things about this form of inversion that are good to know. Firstly, I rarely hear the phrase, if I were you, said as an inverted sentence, probably because it's actually an idiomatic expression. In my research, I found that it was used in a book in 1832. So if you are writing in an archaic register, it might make sense. But apart from that, I would just avoid it. The same goes for saying, were I to be you, which I've come across in some textbooks as saying it's okay. This does sound very strange. It could make sense in the context of assigning roles in a play, like, were I to be you instead of Mr. Brown, I believe I would be more convincing. So it's not impossible to use in the right context, but this is a very particular context. So on to the third conditional. Like the form of the second conditional, we use the auxiliary verb that's found in its normal sentence and place that at the start of the if clause. So with the third conditional, this would be the auxiliary verb had. We then follow this with the subject and then the past participle verb. So if I had the statement, if I had known, I would have told you, the inverted form would be, had I known, I would have told you. Of all the inverted conditionals, I would say that this is probably the most straightforward. This is because unlike inverting the zero and first conditionals, we don't need to use an auxiliary verb, which we don't often find in the normal sentence, and unlike inverting the second conditional, there is only one way to do it. And another thing, I think this kind of inversion is actually a little more widely said than the second conditional. I just want to talk briefly about the phrase, if it weren't for. It's often used to show gratitude or bitterness to someone or something, depending on the result in the main clause. If it weren't for you, I would never have arrived on time. Or,
and I would have succeeded too if it weren't for you meddling schoolmates.
I'm mentioning this because it's fairly common to hear it in an inverted form too, and it follows the general pattern of the second conditional if clause. But it can also be used with the third conditional, were it not for plus an object. Were it not for you, I would never have arrived on time. Were it not for COVID, life would be a lot better. If you found this video interesting, then subscribe to my channel to get more videos on the English language and how it works. Okay, so that's all for today. If you've got any questions, please leave a comment. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.